Games are great for learning languages. Here are 10 ways you can use games to learn or teach Chinese as a second language. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about games. I've always been interested in games, digital or analog, so it's great to be able to combine this with another passion, which is of course learning and teaching Chinese. You don't have to be an avid gamer to reap the benefits of games as a learning tool though, so in this episode I'm going to go through 10 different ways of using games to learn and teach Chinese. The idea here is mainly to use games that exist outside of the classroom, so I'm not talking about games mainly that are produced for the purpose of teaching Chinese. Because one of the great things with games is that they have a purpose, and that is usually to entertain. And if they fail to do that, they won't become popular, and you probably haven't heard the names of games that nobody enjoyed. This is, I think, a helpful way of thinking about activities when learning languages in general, which is perhaps most relevant for teachers. But if an activity is interesting beyond language learning, it is probably a good activity. And one way of testing this is to remove the language learning and say, if you did this in your native language, would it be interesting? So playing a game is, of course, interesting in your native language. Most games are not designed for language learning purposes after all, and games are popular and people like them. This is not limited to games, of course, so if your teacher designs an exercise that would be kind of interesting to do or talk about in your native language, that has a much higher likelihood of being an interesting exercise rather than one that is fully dependent on the language itself, such as a grammar drill or a vocabulary drill or something like that, that really doesn't work at all in your native language. Before we go through the 10 ways of using games to learn and teach Chinese, I'd like to say a few words about why games are useful. And I've already said that they are entertaining, and I think that's what most people think about. But in my opinion, games are very useful for learning and teaching languages far beyond being entertaining. Having fun while learning a language is very important, so I'm not saying that's not the point, but I'm also saying that there are other points, which means that even if you don't love games, there might be useful things in these games that you would benefit from anyway. So the first thing I want to say is that when you use Chinese in games or when playing games, you're using the language as a tool to get somewhere, to reach a goal. This is indeed how languages are usually used in real life too. We say things because we want to do something or achieve something, but in classrooms this is sometimes forgotten and we do things without having a communicative goal, or we don't use the language as a tool, we study the tool itself. And that can be interesting and sometimes useful, but we do it far too much. And if we play games, we kind of tend to forget this and we use the language as a tool to obtain something else. The second thing I want to bring up is that games encourage communication, and I want to stress the word here, real communication. We're not talking about reading a dialogue or doing a scripted exercise or something. When you play games, you use the language to communicate, to convey information to other players, or to understand what they are saying or what's going on in the game. And this is, again, very akin to what happens in real life, but sometimes rather distant from what happens in classrooms. Finally, games are also great for motivation. You can either cooperate with other people or compete against them, or sometimes both if there are teams. And for most people, this makes the whole activity more worthwhile. And I'm not saying you have to compete all the time. Like I said, you can play games where you cooperate against the game, or maybe against a teacher or something else. But playing games is still a very social activity in most cases. Okay, so let's dive into the 10 ways of using games to learn and teach Chinese. And the first one is games that focus explicitly on language. As I think most listeners are aware, there are many games that focus on words, vocabulary, and language in general. In this category, I think Scrabble is probably the most well-known one, although these types of letter-based games don't work really well in Chinese. So, for example, a game like Boggle, which I love, is about finding words in scrambled letters in an allotted time. And since Chinese doesn't have letters in that sense, these types of games don't really work. There are other games that do work really well though, and I've mentioned one of them on the podcast before, and that was in episode 73 when we talked about Alias or other word-guessing games where you're supposed to explain something in Chinese without using the word itself, and your teammates are then supposed to guess the word that you are describing. Another great game in this category is Codenames, and I've written an article about that, although it hasn't appeared on the podcast yet, so I'll put a link in the description. So over to number 2, games that focus on debate and discussion. These games usually require you to have a certain basic level of Chinese to be able to have a conversation or discussion about something, although you can get pretty far with some scaffolding and help. A good example of this is games with a hidden murderer or hidden identity of some kind, where the rest of the players try to figure out who the bad guy is before the bad guy kills all the good guys. Or sometimes it's phrased in a more friendly or children-friendly manner, but that's what the games are about. And we have, for example, Mafia, or Are You a Werewolf, or Among Us, and so on, and they all focus around these themes. These are excellent for learning Chinese and work well in classrooms too, and Diane Neubauer has written 2 articles about this, and I'll put links in the description to those if you are interested. There are also many great games in this genre that requires fairly advanced levels of Chinese to make sense as a learning tool, and that are in themselves also rather complicated sometimes, so you would probably have to find people who like games to play these games anyway. And examples here might include Diplomacy or Space Alert, which are both games that I love but would be rather hard to play with normal people. Moving on to number 3, which is about using games to tell stories. It's rather fascinating how much easier it is to tell a story when you have certain constraints, such as those imposed by a game, compared with if you're just supposed to make up a story about anything you want. And there are many games that take advantage of this phenomenon, such as Once Upon a Time or Story Cubes. And these are about randomly assigning certain elements that appear in stories, and then as a player you're meant to create a story based on what you have, and sometimes, as in Once Upon a Time, you're supposed to divert the story that you tell together to fit your own goals and your own ending. I really like games like these, and I play them a lot, and I actually published such a game too about 10 years ago with a friend. And it's about old retired heroes that tell stories about past glories, and the goal here is to impress the grandchildren. The problem is that none of the oldies really remember what happened, and nobody knows who slew the dragon and so on, so everybody just makes everything up to make sure that they look very good and the others look bad. So it's a game about boasting and bragging and telling stories, in other words. The game is called Nostalgia, but the first version was only available in Swedish, and we are working on an English version, although we have been working on that for a very long time, so I don't really know when it will be published. But it will be published at some point, and I will make sure to notify you when that happens. Number 4 is about a related topic, namely role-playing games. And these are games where you assume a role of some sort and put yourself in a situation that you're normally not in. And this can create a lot of opportunities to learn language that wouldn't otherwise be very accessible to you. And you can pretend that you are in certain situations that you actually would like to be able to deal with in Chinese. And this is of course already used by teachers quite a lot, although the game elements are rather toned down in classrooms most of the time. This is something I have written about on Hacking Chinese before, so I'll make sure to put a link in the description. Number 5 is digital games in Chinese, or digital games that contain Chinese. And this is rather common these days. Many of the major titles being released have dubs in other languages, and Chinese is usually one of the languages that they do provide. This is not always the case, of course, and sometimes the Chinese version isn't very good or the translation is a bit awkward and so on, but there are still many games out there that have a very big budget and that do have Chinese voiceovers. This is excellent if you already like these games and you can play them in Chinese then, or if you like similar games, you might choose a game specifically because it has decent Chinese audio, for example. Depending on what type of game this is, this might either be very difficult or not very difficult at all. So for example, if you play a real-time strategy game like Starcraft 2 or something like that, which does have Chinese, you don't really need to understand what the units are saying, but you do get a lot of repetition about specific things. Obviously, if you play through a story, and this also goes for role-playing games and other games that are more story-focused, then the Chinese content goes up a lot and the difficulty also ramps up pretty quickly. Moving on to number 6, this is about using Chinese when playing games in general, not a specific type of game, but just using Chinese while playing games. For example, you can do this with your favorite board games, so if you're playing Settlers of Catan or something like that, you can do it in Chinese. There isn't that much interaction required, but you do need to trade, you need to talk about whose turn it is, and you might have some small talk going on around the table and so on. And all these things are great to have in Chinese. One option is to teach these games to native speakers of Chinese. They might not have played them and might enjoy them. You can also play them in a classroom setting, of course, with other learners, or if you're a teacher, you can prepare games that are specifically suited for learning Chinese, and you can support your students in various ways. Number 7 is not really about playing games as such, but it's about learning about or reading about games in Chinese that you're interested in for some other reason. And this is akin to relying on hobbies or tapping into the power of hobbies or something else you're interested in to learn Chinese. So if you're a passionate Overwatch player or something else, you can check out what people are saying about the game, reviews, tactics, strategies, and so on in Chinese. One thing I'd like to mention here that I maybe should have said when we talked about digital games as well is that you don't need to worry that much about games having very specific vocabulary. That is true, but it's not as specific as you think. If you listen to a gamer talking about something in your native language, you might be struck by how many weird words there are that you might not even know what they mean if you don't play the game. But these stand out because these are the words you don't understand. All the sentences are still usually quite normal, and there are tons of normal language in there too. And by learning a dozen or a few hundred words specific to a game, and that's nothing if you're really interested in it, then the rest of the language is the same, and you can learn a lot of normal Chinese from playing these games or reading about them as well. Number 8 is the only one here which is specifically for language learners, and that's because I have, together with Kevin Beloy over at WordSwing, created a series of text games that are meant specifically for language learners, and where your comprehension of what's going on in the game, either you can get this through listening or through reading or both, determines how you progress in the game. So the more you understand, the better choices you will be able to make, and different things will happen in the game, and the story will progress differently depending on your choices. I have, of course, written about these games before, so I will put links in the description if you're interested, and the game Escape is completely free to play, and I'll put a separate link to that as well. Number 9 is culturally significant games, and there are a few of those in Chinese that are very closely connected to Chinese culture that are good to know, not just because games are fun or you can learn languages through games, but they can also function as a kind of gateway to the culture, and you can get to know people in a way that you wouldn't be able to without the game. So the 3 big games here are Mahjong or Mahjong, or however it's pronounced in English, I actually don't know. Xiangqi, which is Chinese chess, and Weiqi, which is usually known in the West by its Japanese name Go, or Go, I guess. You can learn a lot of Chinese through these games. I sometimes use Mahjong to teach numbers and things like that to beginners, but I think they are more important from a cultural perspective than from a linguistic one. So being able to play these games can be very handy, and you can often see people in China play at least Xiangqi and Mahjong quite a lot. And if you can play these games, you will be able to join sometimes, and that will open doors that otherwise would have been closed to you. The 10th and final way of using games to learn and teach Chinese, I think, is more reserved for teachers, and that is using elements from games in contexts that are not themselves games. This is often called gamification, and you may be associated with using, say, badges, scoreboards, points, and so on to motivate learners, for example, to do something. And this can be abused and put a very nice and stylish surface on something that isn't very interesting if you dig a little bit deeper, and this can be seen in many apps, of course. But I do think that this is still something that can be very valuable, and it's incredible how much you can improve motivation by showing progress, for example. This is one of the undoubtedly positive things from gamification. Modern digital games are very good at showing you progress. They give you many signs that you are learning, that you're making progress, that you're leveling up, or whatever it is. Whereas if you're learning Chinese, sometimes we feel that we're not learning anything, at least if we've reached the intermediate plateau or even beyond it. So showing you and making the progress that you make visible is something games are very good at, and that's something I think that we as teachers could learn a lot from. So that was 10 different ways of using games to learn and teach Chinese. I don't think this list is exhaustive, and I can easily spend one episode or article on each category and digging deeper into each. I already have in some cases, and I've mentioned that, but there's a lot more to talk about when it comes to learning Chinese through games, so I hope to be able to return to this topic in the future. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.